Good morning. You get the real me instead of the virtual me. That was last year. This is this year. It is an honor to be with you, and I thought this morning I could open up by walking you into a little bit about my own journey with Faith and Work, which I think speaks to what all of us have as a journey for Faith at Work. And then second, a frame of reference for how some colleagues and I have found a way to implement the integration of faith and work. So if there's anything I can leave with you today, it will be hopefully this simple idea of what it looks like to actually make faith at work happen, the how-to. I was struck this morning as we were talking about this idea of work as worship. That to me is the fundamental baseline in a world that doesn't understand that those things are integrated. They're typically acculturated into our lives as separated. So we typically think of ourselves as going to church on Sunday and work on Monday, and there's this big wall. And that's a lie from the pit of hell. There is a word in the Old Testament, the word avodah. It's Hebrew. It means both work and worship synonymously. And if there's anything that you do take away from today, it's that. I also know after I speak this morning, we're doing a panel on mental health, which has a lot of connection to work, but especially from what I understand in Nairobi right now and in Kenya, where you feel so much of the stress and pressure that can come with work and the effect that it can have on you mentally and emotionally. I get that because, to be honest, it was that kind of work life that triggered my faith life. So I want to briefly revisit my testimony so that I can share with you almost like a preview of what I think this panel is going to cover. I did not grow up in a Christian household. In fact, both of my parents had walked away from the church when I was a little kid. If anything, when Christianity did come up, there was almost this asterisk that mom and dad didn't talk about, but it was sort of assumed that there was something bad about Christianity. So I held that in my spirit, but I didn't know what to do with it. And when I got to Harvard University, which is the most cosmopolitan place that I've ever lived, where I had friends from all over the world and all the faith traditions of the world, and I heard all of those faith testimonies, and I saw how many people guide their lives on the basis of their faith. I was fascinated by that. But that was on the back burner of my life because the front burner was all about an emerging career. And I don't know the ages of everybody that's here this morning, but if I dial back my own life and I remember what it was like when you're in your late teens or your early 20s and you want to establish a career, you want to go out and leave school and go into the real world, and you want to be able to make a mark and to climb the ladder and to feel like you're having an impact. And I left school with all of those aspirations. And I landed in Cincinnati, Ohio for a job at a multinational consumer products corporation, Procter & Gamble. And I shared with all of you last year, so I'm giving you the abbreviated version this year. But much to the horror of my parents, who were both English professors, had taken out a second mortgage to send their son to Harvard, I graduate and I work in a company, not in academia, on toilet paper. And this is now my work life. So I'm leaving Harvard University for the glamorous world of toilet paper. And when I joined the brand to which I was assigned, it was called White Cloud. Today it's a very high-end part of the Charmin brand in the United States. Yeah. Lots of people love Charmin, but not enough people loved White Cloud. And so when I was hired, the company was worried about the brand. They knew I had an entrepreneurial personality. So they told me they wanted me to bring an entrepreneurial spark to toilet paper. And I told them that could be very dangerous. Well, it turned out my assignment was pretty dangerous. Within 6 months, my entire brand group had been fired from the company. The company was looking at White Cloud and saying, you're only doing $60 million a year in sales. Your market share isn't adequate. We need you to fix that. So I had spent 6 months on a top secret project. It was a SWAT team, that was short for Sell White Cloud at $2 a 4-roll. And at the end of 6 months, the conclusion that came back was that we had a product that was softer and thicker than anyone wanted to pay for. It was over-engineered for something that you flushed down the toilet. So the only way that we were going to sell more was to figure out how to take some kind of a price increase and change the dynamics of the brand. So we took off 30 sheets from each roll. We wound them more loosely, so the diameter of the roll was the same as before the sheet count reduction. We took a very small increase in the thickness of the paper, and my job was to market it as new and improved. New because it had 30 fewer sheets, and improved because it was thicker. And I was less than inspired. So I had a mental health problem. I had a midlife crisis at the age of 22. 6 months out of Harvard University, imagining what a career was going to look like, and now embarking on one, and my work life wasn't anything like I thought it was going to be. And I remember walking home from work on that day when I was assigned this project, and I was thinking to myself, I'm going to get promoted for short sheeting the consumer. And it felt completely empty. And I don't know about all of you, but I would wager that there are times in your work life where you go to work and you feel like it's empty, it's hollow, it's fragmented. You drive to work, and when you park, you feel like you're parking most of you at the door, and you can't bring it into your job. I've had to learn over the years the difference between what I would call a job description and a role description. A job description is what you have to do as an employee of a company. A role description is who you are as an ambassador for Christ in the place where you have been strategically deployed to advance the kingdom. But I didn't have any concept for that because I wasn't a Christian. And so it was my frustration with work that drove me to a spiritual search. I spent 10 years studying comparative world religion and philosophy. And I came to Christ as a young working professional. So frustration with work brings me to faith. And then I start asking the question, what does it look like to integrate faith into all of my life, including my work? I can remember like yesterday, I drew this diagram on a piece of paper because I'm a visual thinker and learner. And in the center was God in a circle. And then the circle around that was my whole life. And I had these different sections of my life. There was my life at work, there was my life at home, there's life for just me. And I looked at it and I thought, wow, I spend most of my waking hours at work. But when I look at the working Christians around me, the vast majority of them do nothing with their faith in their everyday work. Keep in mind, I had come to Christ not because I'd been so active in a local church, but because I had spent 10 years studying comparative world religion, and my concept of church was largely informed by the early church as recorded in the New Testament. My favorite book of the Bible, the book of Acts, where the apostles came from the marketplace. And the marketplace was a central staging area for their ministry. And God was moving supernaturally through the marketplace. And then I start going to church. And I discover that my Christian friends and peers are spiritually dead at work. And I was stunned because being a guy who was trained in corporate, in brand management, you're supposed to figure out the needs of your consumer and meet them. And I'm thinking to myself, if most of the people in the pews are spending most of their waking hours at work, why wouldn't work life be one of the most important focus areas for the local church when it comes to faith life? Now we have marriage ministry, youth ministry, recovery ministry, all kinds of great ministries. But what about 9 a.m. to 5 p.m.? What about Monday through Saturday? This question kept eating at me. I didn't know the word calling back then. If somebody had said to me back in those days, calling, I would have said, somebody's calling me. But what I've come to understand was that God was calling me to first figure out in my own life what it would look like to integrate faith and work, and then to help others to do the same. And so over a period of years, I have walked through this journey. It's interesting, if you look at the research, and there isn't much, but if you look at the research that's out there on working Christians and the extent to which they even get this idea that we're talking about, work as worship, you'll find, and this is a 2019 study by the Barna Research Organization, which is out of the United States. They do a lot of really detailed research with Christians. This particular study was asking working Christians across the United States how many of them would even aspire or hope to, or on their best day, would bring their faith to their work. And what they got back was that only 1 out of 4, 25% of working Christians, would aspire to integrate their faith and work. 25% roughly would be what they called compartmentalizers, church on Sunday, work on Monday, and 50% onlookers. They want to watch somebody else bring their faith to their work, and when they get in trouble, they can figure out how to not make the same mistake, right? Yeah, and I know you guys get that, because at best, the workplace is indifferent to faith expression most of the time, but it's increasingly hostile. What does it look like to be gentle as a dove but wise as a serpent when it comes to faith integration at work, when it comes to work as a form of worship? I began wondering about this, not just for myself, but for others. And I remembered back to my days at Harvard where I did a lot of research projects. So I decided to do one. I spent a couple years to ask questions of everyday working Christians. Some were new to work, some were close to retirement, men and women, all different vocational paths, public sector, private sector, social sector, different parts of the country. And what came back was 5 overarching spiritual struggles that all of us face at work. And for each one of them, there is a spiritual solution which comes straight out of God's Word and which enables us to understand what it looks like for an everyday Christian to bring a Sunday faith to a Monday work. Now, when you guys got here for the conference, hopefully everybody got one of these, yes? Does this look familiar? I wanted every one of you to have these because this is a simple way to summarize that research. What I want to do is walk through this, and we've got the panel coming up in a few minutes, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time right now, but this afternoon, when I speak again, I'm going to deal with this in a deeper way. But what I'll tell you right now, if you open this up, it says in the page that's on the left, it's experiential. What do we experience when it comes to faith at work? Well, we experience a struggle because Satan has a great strategy to immobilize our faith at work, because if we're asleep at the switch spiritually, the places where we work, then some of our most significant spiritual impact for the world is lost because we were not faith active at our jobs. The first struggle in here is the struggle of sacred versus secular. Will we view work as one aspect of an integrated life of faith or a separate space where God is not present? The solution here is to understand that work is worship. Anything that isn't sinful is sacred, and there is no secular. The second struggle is calling versus career. Will we pursue the vocation for which God created us, or settle for the career that the world tells us is better? And the solution there is to define God's purpose for our work, not just our job description, the tasks we do in our job every day, but our role description as an ambassador for the Lord, advancing His kingdom through our everyday work. The third struggle is righteousness versus compromise. Will we uphold God's standards of conduct at work or succumb to the standards of the work world? The solution here is to follow principles biblically while we work. The fourth struggle is growth versus stagnation. Will we view work as a critical arena for spiritual formation or just a place to get a paycheck? And the solution here is to develop ourselves and other people spiritually in and through work. The fifth struggle is stewardship versus ownership. Will we view the resources of the work world as belonging to God for His purposes or belonging to us for ours? And the solution is to extend the prosperity of a working world to the hurting world around us. As the Bible would say, to seek the peace and prosperity of the city where we work and where we live. What was so interesting from this research is that all 5 of these struggles and those solutions, they come up over and over again for working Christians. It doesn't matter what line of work you're in. These are relevant across the board, the struggles and the solutions. If you step back and think about it, every one of us builds our witness at work, one choice at a time. That's why that pretty graphic that's inside is called the Choices Profile. What it's doing essentially is to say to you, when you go to work every day, how are you choosing sacred over secular? How are you choosing calling over career? How are you choosing righteousness over compromise? How are you choosing growth over stagnation? And how are you choosing stewardship over ownership? When we become more conscious of our everyday choices at work, then we can begin to move with the Spirit to understand how God is leading us to become a working witness, to make a choice in the moment that enables us to be in the work world, but not of the work world. You guys tracking with me? Now, this afternoon, I'll have some time to look at this in more detail because there are different levels at which you can find relevance here. But right now, I just want you to think about it for your job, your everyday work. If next Monday morning you go into work and you're conscious of these 5 areas of choice, you'll begin to build a different kind of track record or batting average for how well you honor God through your everyday choices. You know, it's interesting, a closing thought on this. The idea of a sacred-secular divide, which I would argue is ingrained even into our Christian theology today, not that it should be, really traces to dualism, which arose out of Greek philosophy. Plato, in particular, brought this out with something called Platonism. The idea was that you'd separate the sinful and the sacred, so that the sacred things of the world were the ultimate eternal truths. But this secular stuff was just everyday working reality. It was just the tangible, everyday things. What you may not know is how this concept has woven its way into our faith over the centuries. At the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity as the official religion of the state. Now keep in mind, the Roman Empire decided to embrace Christianity because if you can't beat them, join them. Rome had just spent centuries trying to wipe out Christianity, and for reasons that I'll explain this afternoon, they failed. So the idea now is to co-opt Christianity, to weave it into Roman culture, and to establish an official Roman religion, which would be called Christianity. Now, at that council, there were many things that led to the birth of what we would call the Catholic Church that to this day bring forward Christian tradition. But one of the distinctions that Constantine made at that council was a distinction between the clergy and the laity. He called out the clergy as people who were to be set apart for spiritual study. They were not to be burdened with any of the everyday tasks of a normal job. And they were to be funded by the fruits of the laity, the everyday people who were simply supposed to go to work, do their jobs, and then pay money to the clergy who would figure out the spiritual reality of things. Now, as the centuries have passed, that idea of clergy and laity has become increasingly ingrained in the way we think of church. I cringe when I hear those words, but the truth is that they're commonplace. And they're essentially markers for this idea of sacred and secular. So Pastor Pete is sacred because he's part of the clergy, but Janitor Joe is secular because he's just a member of the laity. That is a lie from the pit of hell, but many of us live it. So when we go to work every day, we need to understand that our faith is incarnational. We need to think less about going to church and more about being the church. We need to think less about church as a place and more about church as a person, because the church is the collective body of believers. It's all of us. And I think it's an amazing thing that God has created all of us with unique talents and opportunities so that we are strategically deployed across the workplace. If we were all brain surgeons, how would we advance God's faith in all the other areas of work? He's brought us into business and education and government as a force for reclamation, to reclaim a broken world. You see, our bigger role isn't just to get by, it's to help God's kingdom to get ahead. It is truly to fulfill the Great Commission, to make disciples of all nations. And we will never do that until we include work at every level. Now we're a little past 12, and I promised that I would wrap this part up in time for the panel discussion. But before we go there, let me just pause for any questions you guys may have from this right now. I left you speechless. That may be a good thing or a bad thing. No questions. Wow. If there aren't, then what I need to do is turn this back over to our MCs because we have a panel discussion coming up. Thank you.